Namaste. My name is Preity Upala, and I am a global thought leader and a multimedia personality. Welcome to my podcast, The Preity Experience. Join me as I explore some of the most fascinating and crucial issues that affect our world today. I take a unique global perspective on these issues, and the very foundation of my insights is humanity and spirituality. I'm Preity Upala, and welcome to the Preity Experience.
Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. Amid the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, the United States is all set to vote in the upcoming presidential elections due in November. The elections are a direct contest between sitting US President and Republican nominee Donald Trump and Democratic nominee Joe Biden, who was Vice President during the Barack Obama presidency. Earlier, on July 30th, through a series of tweets, President Trump sparked a political firestorm in America after he suggested that the upcoming presidential elections should be delayed on account of the COVID-19 pandemic. Though he later clarified, saying that he does not want to delay the election, but expressed apprehensions that counting of mailed ballots could take weeks and hamper the results, leading to a compromised poll. His suggestion was immediately criticized by leaders of the opposition, the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, Biden's supporters have also announced a launch of outreach in 14 languages to influence the Indian American community. In the big picture, we will analyze the upcoming US elections. Joining me on the program today are Prabhu Dayal, former ambassador, Preity Upala, foreign editor of The Observer California, and KV Prasad, senior associate editor of The Tribune. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. All right, Preity, let me start the program with you first. Let's first try and understand and analyze, of course. This is the final stretch of the election in the US. What is the sense on the ground?
Well, thank you, Mr. Pereira, for having me on your show. This is the most extraordinary election in US history. On the one hand, it's a very important election, but on the other, it's incredibly subdued, I think, the most ever in the entire history. Foreign policy is actually going to end up being the heart of this election. I think with the COVID crisis and the dwindling economy, President Trump has no choice but to now push the foreign policy agenda. He will make China the central focus in the months leading up to the election. And in this regard, he actually will have a lot of support, not just from his base, but also from across the country, because recent polls have shown the distrust and the disdain that the American public has shown towards China vis-a-vis the pandemic. So this actually works nicely for him. On the contrary, with the candidate Biden, he finds himself kind of on the back foot, so to speak, because I think the public does see him and his party being a little weaker on national security, because that's not really an agenda item that they pushed on. And they know that with his own son's links to China and various other companies, he is not going to take China to task. So analysts are also saying that Trump will actually have an upper hand, so to speak. Of course, we've had these violent protests and riots. Now, sadly, they have been weaponized and politicized in some way by either party, but definitely by the Democratic Party, I would say. And moving closer to the election, I actually predict more of these violent protests. And, I think from mid-October onwards, it's going to be sort of very vulnerable, challenging times. But in some way, if President Trump can get his base to really rally up and come out and vote, because it does seem that there will be a vote, regardless of whether people want it or not, he might find himself in a precarious situation while he might be reelected. So we shall see. The only point I also want to make is that I wouldn't be taking the exit polls for the election very seriously, because remember, in 22nd, right up to the day before the election, it was a 90% in favor of Hillary, and we all know how that turned out. So I think these are very, very exciting times. It's really sort of a luck of the draw, so to speak. So I'm just as excited as everybody else to find out the fate.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. Quite a few, aspects brought in there by Preity Upala. Of course, the protests, China, and everything that's been happening between the United States and China, and of course the pandemic that the entire world is witnessing and is suffering, and also subdued campaigning. KV Prasad, this is the aspect that I want to take up with you. Now, in 2016, we saw a very heated campaign between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. This time around, it seems far more subdued. The campaigning the rhetoric is not that high. What's different this time around, do you think?
Well, I think if you look at the fact is coronavirus and the pandemic has really resulted in an outreach in terms of real campaigning that used to happen the traditional manner. So parties and campaigns are trying to build around this reality. They don't really need to have the numbers. You can't have really a town hall the way they used to have. So much so the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention, which are going to happen later this month, the numbers are far reduced because of the pandemic and the social distancing norms. So that is one reason why everybody is trying to find out how best you can do the outreach. Secondly, I would say that while the campaign looks subdued right now, but just wait for the conventions to get over, because we have what, 88 days from today, November 3rd being the election day, and the real campaign and when the presidential debates start taking place and the tour begins. That's when you'll see rolling out, each one trying to stick charges against the other, take down each other on issues, some of the issues that are already flagged on the program. So this will be really the outcome. It is subdued, yes, for the time being, but as you enter the home stretch, once the convention is over, you'll see a very different kind of a campaign mode. Right.
All right, Ambassador, let me bring you into the picture now. So what are the other factors that are likely to influence the elections? We've been through at least 3 or 4. What do you think is going to be one of the key factors, and what are some of the other factors that are likely to influence the polls?
Well, I would like to take on whatever has been already said by the earlier two panelists, in the sense that the three vital issues which are going to figure in this election are firstly coronavirus, secondly the economy, and thirdly foreign policy, particularly as regards China. Now, President Trump has been blamed by the Democrats for mishandling the coronavirus situation. There are 4.8 million cases in the United States today, and there have been more than 159,000 deaths. And people are crying foul of this whole matter, and Trump is being blamed for having been very, very careless in regard to handling the epidemic when it started. Secondly, the economy has hit everybody. The economy is really in a bad shape in the United States, but of course, it is also so in many other parts of the world. Now, Trump has promised to cut taxes. In contrast, Biden has promised a $3 trillion package and has offered to raise the minimum wage. So they are pandering to different sections of the American electorate. Of course, their focus on China as the evil player in this entire situation is going to be very much there. Biden had been known to be in favor of a comprehensive dialogue with China, but now his position seems to be weakening in this regard. He's changing his position, and he is beginning to take a tougher position as regards human rights violations in China. Even in regard to Taiwan, he has become more equivocal. So I think that in this sort of a situation where everything is going to be virtual, You mentioned that there is not so much of hue and fanfare, excitement about the elections. This is because of the coronavirus-related situation. Everything is virtual. The conventions of the two political parties would be virtual, and for this reason, things are subdued. But it doesn't mean that public anger is not there. There is a certain degree of anger with President Trump and the Republicans. Even within the Republican Party, there is a sort of a divide on this in this regard. So, to come back to my central point, the three major issues which will feature during the run-up to the November 3rd elections would be coronavirus, the economy, and China. Mind you, on November 3rd, we will only be electing the voters, the Electoral College. But then the final vote would take place in December when the Electoral College itself will vote. Of course, the Electoral College will vote as per its party affiliations. But technically, on November 3rd, we will only be witnessing the election of the Electoral College in the United States.
All right, then let me take the point that one of the points that the ambassador was making forward with you, Preity, and given your, background in investment banking, let's talk about the economy and how much of an impact the economic condition in the United States is likely to have. Job losses and all of these things have been taking place over the last few months. How much of how much is it playing on the minds of the electorate?
I don't think we've ever seen a situation when the economy has played or will play such a big role in any election. Now, sadly, this pandemic has had irreversible effects on the U.S. economy. The second quarter data has just come in, and I think we've had maybe the worst quarter in history. This is worse than the depression of the late 1920s. The decline of the second quarter GDP is about 33%, which is more than it's ever been. And the unemployment currently sits at 11%. I actually fear it's higher than 11%, but the official record says 11%. And with the unemployment benefits quickly evaporating, I think the U.S. finds itself in a really, really tight situation economically. This obviously will play on the minds of the voters. And I personally predict a recession and possibly a depression in the following years to come. That's a big claim to make, but I just feel like all the signs are there, and it's very unfortunate that this would be the case. I think nobody had expected that a health crisis would stop the world economy in the way that it has, and completely affect, democracies and governments and even elections around the world. My fear is that more people will end up dying because of financial and economic reasons than the actual health crisis itself. Because when you look at the actual numbers, the analysts will say it's 1% fatality rate, which is very low. But the way that everything has just been halted, I don't think it's very healthy at all. It's the cases of mental depression, suicide, and mental health, I think, are increasing around the world, but especially here where there's already an opioid addiction and people are already, healthcare is the weakest, wicket of the United States in many ways. So the future does not look good. However, I think it's up to both candidates to somehow persuade the voters into trusting them that they still would do a better job than the other. So I don't know how far they'll go in that, but sadly the economy is going to play a huge role, and it's not looking pretty down the future.
Let me bring in another aspect now. We've spoken about the economy. Let's talk about this major, Black Lives Matter movement that has taken place all over the world. KV Prasad, the George Floyd death and the aftermath and the movement that we've seen, not just in the United States, but the rest of the world. How big an issue is that? How much of it is playing on the minds of the voters? And is law and order as a situation as a whole, a problem in the United States?
Well, of course, we see three strands emerging out of the crisis which happened in Minneapolis. One, of course, straight away was defunding the police. That became a big issue for a while. There was a big difference of opinion as to how that needs to be handled. That has come down to a certain extent. The temperatures on that have gone down to a bit. But the Portland crisis has come in. The way American president has used the federal police or federal force in various aspects is already reaching out. It's standing out a debate in a different kind. The Black Lives Matter has, remember, probably that is one reason why we are now talking of the American presumptive president, the Democratic Party President Joe Biden, looking at one. He has said he's going to take a woman as a partner on the ticket. So we have three names, six names going around. They happen to be a Jamaican American, Indian American. If you like, say, Kamala Harris' name is turned on when. So we have a series of names which are being talked about. So all these are outreach. A messaging has to be sent across. But I think this has gone beyond just politics because it has changed the way. I've been there and I've seen the manner in which the Hill works. But the way in which this post Minneapolis event, the things have changed, the drift stopped in a way. I think that's something which is really amazing. I have seen for such a long time.
All right. So let me bring in another aspect in as well. All right. We've got 30 minutes, so it's a short duration. Can't keep, we'll have to try and get in as many aspects as possible. I'm going to go back to a point that Preity Upala was making during her opening remarks, something that you touched upon as well, Ambassador. The ties between Washington and Beijing have reached a low really over the recent past. Is that really going to matter to the American on the ground who's going to go and vote?
To some extent, it no doubt will. And that is why both the candidates are going hammer and tongs at China. Trump has announced that he wants TikTok to sell away its unit here in the United States, and it will stop functioning there unless it is bought over by an American unit. Biden, on his part, had called the Chinese thugs. He had said that the Chinese Communist Party is a thug for having 1 million Uyghurs in reconstruction camps, which he meant, the detention camps. So both the candidates have been going very, very hard at China because I think it does matter to convey that they are prepared to be tough where China is concerned. There is a growing concern that China has taken away American jobs, that China has adversely affected the American economy, that China is playing a negative role in global affairs. So it does seem quite relevant for both the presidents to take a tough line towards China at this particular juncture. Now, once they're elected, what the line will be may be different, and that would remain to be seen, because policies evolve and presidents sometimes revisit whatever they have said during their electioneering. But at the moment, there is no doubt that projecting China as an evil power and taking a tough stance towards China does suit their electoral policies and does fit in with the dynamics of the global situation. President Trump has praised India for being tough with China because in his view, and which is shared widely, it is important to stand up to the Chinese, whether it is in terms of technology or whether it is in terms of geopolitics, whether it relates to Ladakh or whether it relates to the South China Sea. So I think the point that President Trump is making is very much the same as the Australians have been making, or as we have been making, that it is important to stand up to a country like China, because otherwise it is trying to swamp its way all over and it's imposing neo-colonialism on much of the world. So I think the China factor is going to be quite significant in the discussions relating to the US presidential elections.
Time now to take the discussion forward and bring in some more aspects. Let's talk about Indian Americans. Preity Upala, what does this election mean for the Indian Americans and the bilateral relationship between India and the United States as a whole? We seem to be seeing both the Democrats and the Republicans trying to lure the Indian Americans and trying to like KV Prasad said, the Joe Biden is trying to look at an Indo-American vice president running mate. Whether he actually chooses an Indian American still remains to be seen. But clearly, overtures are being made to the Indian community.
So at 4 million, Indian Americans obviously make up only a very tiny voting or electoral group, let's say. However, I think this is one time where they will be more influential, and I think their voice will be heard more, and it will matter more because of their increasing ability to support financially candidates and just voice out their preference digitally as well as through word of mouth. I personally think Indian Americans are stuck between a rock and a hard place during this election. On the one hand, I think they align with the values espoused by the Democratic Party, freedom, liberty, liberal values. And traditionally, obviously, they've voted Democrat. Almost 80% of Indians usually vote Democrat in the previous couple of elections. However, the recent stance that the certain factions of the DNC and just the party in general has taken towards some of the actions of the government of India, such as the abrogation of Article 370 and now the recently passed CAA Act, has sort of riled up the community because I think they've taken an antagonistic position towards a major ally. And I don't think the community is taking this very kindly. They feel, some parts of the community feel this as an attack directly on them. And, you mentioned overtures. I think President Trump is somebody who's out and out wooing the Indian American community. We've seen that he obviously shares the great chemistry with Prime Minister Modi. But when you look at the Democratic Party, even on Biden's official election manifesto, his sort of what he wants to do for the Indian American community is somewhere at the very, very bottom. And in fact, he has been recently pandering to large, groups of other religious minorities at the agony of the Indian community because they feel that he's not calling out atrocious human rights activities that are happening in our neighborhood. So I actually see a divide between the Indian community. I see a shift. More people will move center, and I think many will move right. Trust me, there are concerted efforts. There's a lot of Indian groups online that are really excited about pushing the pro-Trump bandwagon. So I think this will not be as skewed as it was before. How skewed or how much the shift will be will remain to be seen, but it will not be an 80% like it's been in the past. This much I can say for sure.
Okay. All right. KV Prasad, we've discussed several issues now over the last 25 minutes or so, but at the end of the day, do you believe that it is just going to come down to the swing states? Because that's how we've seen elections being decided in the past.
Well, that of course matters a lot because the battleground states are known. And in fact, I think if I peruse the report this morning, papers from the US, I did realize that the Trump campaign and people are looking at the states where the battleground states and where they can swing states and where even the points that Preity mentioned on the Indian Americans, some of them who voted the Democrats last time, how they can kind of bring them over. So this isn't, while the numbers may be less, but the everything matters when the numbers add up. Because one thing which is the bane of American politics as much as another is getting the voter out. That has been an issue all the time. I think one of the highest turnouts came at the time when Obama worked his campaign out. So this has been an issue. We have to see many factors are there. and with the kind of controversy over the mailing of ballots going on right now, these are all factors that will add on to it. But yes, there are issues on table, and I think one issue that India and Indian Americans would always like to look at is what's going to happen on the H-1B and the immigration issue, because that's something which is again on the table. If you look at it, what President Trump's latest executive order.
On this particular point, Ambassador, I'd like to bring you in because there's so much that is said about, running a free and fair election in the United States. We saw what happened last time around as well. Russians were blamed. There is a deep concern about this issue. Do you believe that this issue is going to be another major issue this time around?
Well, we'll have to wait and see because of the fact that foreign influences are bound to be at play in a major election like this, but whether they can have any decisive role remains to be seen. Now, there was a little mention a while back about the Indian American community. I agree that its numbers are not large, but then about 1.3 million Indian Americans are expected to be voting this year. And they are in a sizable presence in some of the biggest states of the United States: California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Georgia. These are some of the biggest states in terms of the number of delegates they have for the Electoral College. And the presence of the Indian American community in these places is quite significant. And that is why the Indian American community is watching with great interest whether Kamala Harris will be selected by Joe Biden as his vice presidential nominee, whether she'll be on the ticket with him. This assumes significance because whatever the number of the Indian Americans, this factor could play a role in attracting the Indian American vote. The relationship between Trump and Prime Minister Modi is warm, and of course, it has become warmer as time has elapsed. The Howdy Modi event was very significant. Then Namaste Trump here in India. But surprisingly, this has not held back Trump from taking some tough steps against India, whether it concerns H-1B visas or whether it concerns tariffs on steel and aluminium products or taking India out of the GSP preferred list. Now, whether the India factor will play a role in his elections or not remains to be seen. But there is no doubt about the fact that the China factor will, because China is increasingly regarded by American politicians as a menace, and there is no division on this count. And that is why both President Trump and candidate Biden have been going very hard at China. Now, one last point that I would like to make is that in America, it is the system of winner take all in most states except Maine and Nebraska. That is to say, if the Electoral College votes are more in favor of one party, then that party gets the entire number of seats which the Electoral College gives to that particular state. This factor is going to be very, very interesting because we'll have to keep an eye on how the parties are faring in the respective states between now and the 3rd of November. And I think Preity will bear me out on this, that the conventions will be virtual in nature, but will still be extremely interesting because they will determine how the swing states and the big states will be voting in this year's presidential election.
All right, there's time to get one last comment on the program. Preity, close the show for us with what to expect in the next 3 months in the lead up to November 3rd.
Just to add on to what everyone has said, regardless of whichever way the election goes, I think the largest democracy in the world and the oldest democracy in the world ought to work together. So one way or another, we hope to take this relationship further. Unfortunately, as far as the next 3 months are concerned, I don't see it being a pretty sight. I predict that the protests will get more violent in nature, and they will increase leading up to the election. I think somewhere in mid-October onwards, you could see this happening. I think America is searching for its soul right now. This is a nation that is very divided, and they really should find something within themselves to come together. And they do love this country. There is incredible pride, and they find themselves in an interesting situation right now. So let's hope that the election actually boosts the morale of the voters.
Okay, all right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that there are several issues really as far as the elections are concerned. There's the pandemic, there's the economy, there are the protests, there is China as well. We've seen the subdued campaigning thus far, but expect it to get heated as in the days to come is what the panelists are suggesting. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.